Day 1101 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 874,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,060 in the past day, with a continued scraping of the bottom of the barrel scene. Like this example I meant to show you guys a week or two ago as it relates to Russian soldiers going from the SMO to the hospital, then pulled back to the SMO, like this chap, who either had a second operation or planned to have a second operation, getting pulled out of the hospital and quite literally carried into the SMO van. We also see someone here holding crutches, presumably for the guy going into the van, which might actually mean now that if you're good enough to use crutches after being in the hospital, then you're good enough for the SMO. But it's not all bad here, as some smiles were seen by an onlooker taking a video, although he does have military coloured apparel and potentially a patch on the side, so maybe he's part of the crew that receives financial bonuses for keeping their military's headcount up. Either way, the whole situation reeks of utter desperation. Then as for the hardware losses, 13 tanks, 17 APVs, and 54 artillery. Then to take a quick look at the weekly territory of control stats, and getting down to brass tacks, as over the period of the last 7 days, the armed forces of Russia have pushed up their total land occupation from 18.60% to 18.61%. And it's important to show this because, although it is a gain, it is minuscule and flies in the face of the Russian propaganda narratives found all over the internet and in the comments below that suggest that Russia is collapsing their enemies' positions across the entirety of the front lines. But never forget, they're collapsing them, so to speak, at speeds that are, well, at this rate, will take over 150 years before total Ukrainian land capitulation. Then headed to the map with more Ukrainian UAV drones that found their way into Russian territory overnight, unobstructed by Russian border defenses against the aerial threat. But where it was perhaps most apparent was at the gas facility in Russia's Kursk region near to Ivanino. But then headed closer to the front lines of Kursk, to Sverdlikovo, where Russian forces continued to hammer into Ukrainian positions, creating a wedge between the AFU's forces on the opposite side of the Sumy border. But did they really create a wedge? Remembering that everything below the border should also be in the color blue, at least it should be in this context, so I've augmented the map to better display the actual Ukrainian positions. And so Russia is looking to achieve one or two things here. Firstly is to cut off Ukrainian forces from the west and east of this Sverdlikovo front, which, as we can see, doesn't help them much, and rather puts them in a little bit of a precarious position there. Then secondly, and surely a much longer term plan, is to choke the Ukrainian incursion salient that heads north, but that's about a 20-kilometer wide gap, give or take, and fraught with difficult terrain and AFU defenses, not to mention a heavily drone-monitored environment. Looking ahead, it's some costly options to consider for the Russian army to proceed. Then somewhere in the Kursk, we saw a completely roofless UAZ Buhanka van of the Russian forces targeted by a Ukrainian FPV. But not just the roof taken off, but also the windows, the doors, the panels, the wiring, and the rest. So on the one hand, Russian vehicles are installed with the cope cages galore, full of all sorts of artistic adaptations, but on the other hand, here we see the completely reverse methodology. No protections at all, not to mention the wind chill factor from being exposed to the elements. Also in Kursk, a Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle was spotted in the camera view of a descending FPV drone from the AFU, And though the footage here is a bit hard to see clearly, this FPV was beaten to the punchline as some sort of external actor, be it a landmine or another projectile, had caused the destruction of this vehicle moments prior. It was a catastrophic detonation. Then briefly into the Ukrainian map today, and to Toretsk to begin with, which seems to be, right now, the gift that keeps on giving, as it so happens for the Ukrainian forces. Because after a botched Russian troop rotation going back, about 5 days now, to the 23rd of February, the Ukrainian defenders took advantage of this situation, making forward movements back into the urban center. Now, the grey area and actual line of conflict within Toretsk remains very unclear. Ukraine has gone from controlling 5% of the city to 10%, at best on February 10, to now reportedly anywhere between 25 and 30%. The Russian army has continued to have ongoing problems on this front. For example, all the lying and covering up with the Russian MOD's false claims about capturing the city on the 10th, leading to reduced support for troops, which has drawn complaints from Russian mill bloggers, with the effective outcome being a slashing of resources that would otherwise have stayed and coordinated itself remaining in this region. And though the situation remains critical for the town, and has been for some time truly, Russian command has definitely had to backtrack on preparing their Chasiv Yar offensives just to the north, where they pulled out some forces from Toretsk, took them to Chasiv Yar, with this location not changing in about 3 weeks now, where it appears the Russian forces have had to move back to Toretsk in the chance to take it again. Now, as for the Toretsk direction, and Pokrovsk for that matter, further below, Ukrainian drone operators have set up a 10 to 20 kilometer deep denial zone between the zero line and second echelon, which essentially means the forwardmost edge of the battlefield to Russian positions in the rear, equating to strikes on invader logistics, leading to most supplies needing to be brought in on foot or bicycle, motorbikes, and small ATVs by the Russians, where up to 50% of material and personnel don't make it to the zero line. Then headed further down on the map to the southeastern edge of the Donbas sector, at the contact point, Russian forces marginally expanded their footprint in the direction of Shevchenko. And if you look far enough into that direction, you'll see on the main arterial, better seen in dark mode, we find Pokrovsk, but not the one we know. Instead, it's beyond the border, positioned in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. And to zoom out for a bit of better context here, this oblast is 100% free of Russians, a location that they've never stepped foot in for the entirety of the war, but knowing Russia, they'd potentially be willing to claim and annex it should they ever cross even 1 inch beyond the invisible borderline, which sounds pretty ridiculous, but I'll tie that in with a news update in just a second. But firstly, taking a look around the map, because somewhere in the east, the Kremlin's army trolls are back in action, but not for any celebratory reasons, with most recently seeing the extraction of a heavily damaged, if not irrevocably damaged, Book M2 SAM system, sent back in the hopes of repair or scrap metal. And though, by contrast, we haven't seen the Russian army extracting their damaged tanks or other vehicles for quite some time, the difference here is that these expensive air defense systems are located a fair way back from the front, leading to their pickup in the hope they can achieve some sort of future value out of them. And I do mean them, because we've seen no less than 4 Book M1, 2s and 3s seeing a similar fate, somewhat deep into the rear, moved for extraction as well in the last few months. Then headed across to some news for today. So Putin and the Kremlin continue to reject specific peace terms, insisting Ukraine surrender unoccupied land. That is to say, Russia finds it acceptable to take all of Zaporizhia and all of Kherson and all of Donetsk, including the parts of those regions that the Russian army has never ever stepped foot in. Their logic? well, they annexed it, so it's theirs for the taking. As for a specific example, the city of Zaporizhia, in the oblast of the same name, Russia is making claims to this location. Never setting here foot militarily. But it's in their constitution now, so it's evidently not a point of negotiation for them. It's all just utterly ridiculous. And it was just recently that US Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized the complexity of the situation, stating, quote, "We have a long way to go," but also adding that it remains to be seen if Russia is genuinely willing to negotiate as part of a peace settlement. Then speaking of the US front, Zelenskyy has arrived in the United States to meet with the US President Donald Trump quite shortly now. On the matter, Trump has described an impending agreement to be signed and calling it very big, quote-unquote, hinting at a mineral deal involving Ukraine's vast rare earth resources, potentially worth many billions. But he also did state that for peace negotiations, if it doesn't happen quickly, then it may not happen at all. Ultimately, Zelenskyy has made the situation quite clear at this point, being that security guarantees are of utmost importance to his country. And though it can be quite pointless to microanalyze most comments that President Trump riffs out when the moment strikes him, he did recently state, quote, "We want to work with Zelenskyy, and we will. He is the best president of Ukraine." Obviously, with this statement coming as a striking contrast to calling him an outright dictator just a week earlier. But since then, a comment that he played down during a meeting with UK PM Keir Starmer when asked on the topic of calling Zelenskyy a dictator. But ultimately, for this upcoming meeting, we'll see if there's any solid commitments to security for Ukraine, or if the outcome is more in line with various reports suggesting that there will be a much more open-ended framework on agreeing to agree about moving together towards future commitments. But you can't rule anything out. It could also be quite an explosive day as well. Meanwhile, European leaders are gearing up for a pivotal summit on March 6, aiming to unify their approach to defense and security guarantees for Ukraine. UK PM Starmer also made a strong declaration that Britain stands ready to deploy troops and aircraft to uphold a future peace deal, and will also host 18 nations on March 2nd to discuss the next steps in negotiations. French President Macron also chimed in on events to say, quote, "To achieve peace, Russia must end its aggression, and this must be accompanied by strong and credible security guarantees for the Ukrainians. Otherwise, there is a risk that this ceasefire will end up like Minsk agreements." So Macron makes some fair points here. Because given those broken Minsk agreements by Russia and many other Russian agreements with Ukraine, there are some very important considerations to make here for any Ukrainian peace negotiations. Then headed across to a little bit of Ukrainian hardware news. So Finland launches a new €660 million defense aid program for Ukraine. The initiative will direct orders to Finland's defense industry, shifting from stock donations to large-scale domestic procurement. The aid would likely include Patria, AMV armored modular vehicles, which offers mobility and versatility for Ukraine's needs. Also expected would be artillery and munitions, plus drones and anti-drone systems. Then in some more hardware news, Ukraine is ramping up its domestic fiber optics production. Ukraine's state security service has tested the Ukrainian-made Silkworm fiber optic modules. These can be fitted to FPV drones, ground robots, and even surface and underwater drones. Notably, FPV drones with Silkworm can operate at distances exceeding 20 kilometers. Crucial innovations they are as the war continues. Then headed across to a few little bits and pieces of Russian economy news updates, more than I could possibly mention at this point, but just to list out a few here. So firstly, the Russian government is imposing a ban on gasoline exports from March 1 to August 31. The decision was made to maintain a stable situation in the domestic fuel market, a market that Ukrainian UAVs have wreaked havoc on. But also, by domestic market, what is really meant here, at least in part, is military consumption of those refined oils. That refinery bingo card isn't getting any smaller. Then to some more economy news. A Moscow Times article reported that 200 billion rubles, or about 2 billion USD, was stolen from Russians in 2024 by Ukrainian scammers, and was a 35% uptick from the previous year. Even still, many have taken to social media to say 2 billion is just rookie numbers, suggesting that they can pump those numbers up to 5 billion this year. Of note, plenty of these scams related to Russian citizens supporting the Russian military, and with that support ending up going to the Ukrainian military instead. Then taking a brief look at the real estate market, where Russia's mortgage market has plunged to a 6-year low, with new mortgage issuance in January 2025 totaling just 1.46 billion in USD. The situation is even more dire as 85% of all loans are now state subsidized, a record high that underscores the market's growing dependence on government support. And to put this crisis into perspective, the entire Russian mortgage market for the month of January is now smaller than Netflix global revenue for the same month. Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys. A little bit of a lowbrow funny perhaps, but here we go. So the Russian representative at the UN, Nebezhnya, who is the one that often propagates these false narratives about the Western-made Ukrainian project, has most recently spoken on the same topic to say, quote, "The world found itself on the brink of World War III because of the anti-Russian Ukraine project." Now, firstly, I always question these World War III scare tactics coming straight from Kremlin mouthpieces. Because who exactly are the belligerents on the Russian side that will fight this grand showdown of a World War III? North Korea and Belarus, with Belarus having a depleted supply of tanks and other hardware they supplied to Russia some time ago. Please. It's the same old tired playbook. Yell global catastrophe loud enough, and maybe people will forget the mess you've already made. And I mean, if we're teetering on the edge of annihilation, why is Putin all of a sudden talking about economic cooperation with Western partners now? Much to the upset of his own population. Then secondly, these Nebezhnya remarks are only a reminder of how the Kremlin mixes up their lies, because although Russian officials have repeatedly referred to the Ukrainian project as a Western-made artificial state to destroy Russia, it's also been the case that, to the complete contrary, Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly, yes, repeatedly stated that Ukraine was a creation of Vladimir Lenin. That's right, old boy Lenin. With those repeated Russian claims made by Putin in the lead up to Russia's full-scale SMO invasion. So it's just another case of Russia using what suits them best in the geopolitical landscape when they need it at the time. And there are so many examples of this whenever it's convenient. All of which is completely contradictory, only adding to their constant streak of Kremlin clownery. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Please continue to like and comment, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!